A black maid proposed to the ruthless billionaire everyone feared, and he accepted instantly. In a world where power means everything, one desperate act changes 2 lives forever. But behind her trembling courage hides a secret, a little boy who whispers a shocking truth that could shatter the billionaire's cold empire. As scandal erupts, society mocks, and love battles pride, the walls around his heart begin to crack. Will the maid's faith and innocence melt the ice of a man no one dared to challenge, or will the secret between them destroy everything before it even begins? What happens when love collides with power, and the truth refuses to stay hidden? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the steel penthouse, casting long shadows across the pristine marble floors. Penelope Johnson moved quietly through the vast space, her cleaning cloth leaving perfect streaks across the spotless surfaces. Every morning was the same routine: arrive early, work diligently, and try to become invisible when the apartment's wealthy residents appeared. From the kitchen, she could hear 2 other maids whispering as they arranged fresh flowers in crystal vases. "Did you hear Mr. Steele destroyed another company yesterday?" one whispered. "Just bought it and fired everyone." "Shh, these walls have ears," the other warned. "You know what happened to Jenny when she gossiped about him." Penelope kept her head down, focusing on her work. She'd learned early on that silence was her best defense in this glittering tower of power. Her thoughts drifted to her 6-year-old son Samuel, safely waiting with kind Mrs. Martinez in her apartment downstairs. His sweet smile and the photo she carried gave her strength through long days like this. The click of expensive heels against marble made Penelope's shoulders tense. Veronica Ashford's voice carried through the penthouse like sharp ice. "Oh, there you are." Veronica stood in the doorway, perfectly manicured and dressed in designer clothes that cost more than Penelope made in months. "The silver in the dining room is spotty. Do it again." Her red lips curved in a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "And do try to actually clean it this time." "Yes, Miss Ashford," Penelope murmured, gathering her cleaning supplies. She'd already polished that silver to perfection, but arguing would only make things worse. As she headed toward the dining room, Veronica's voice stopped her. "Oh, and the caterers are coming for tonight's dinner party. Try to make yourself scarce. We wouldn't want to embarrass Richard by having the help visible when his business associates arrive." The other maids looked away, uncomfortable. Penelope's cheeks burned, but she kept her voice steady. "Of course, Miss Ashford. Honestly," Veronica announced loudly to her audience of staff, "I don't know why Richard keeps such incompetent help. You're lucky to even be here, cleaning in a place like this. Remember that." Penelope's hands trembled as she escaped to the quiet sanctuary of the butler's pantry. Pulling Samuel's worn photo from her pocket, she traced his smiling face with her finger. "Dear God," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "please give me strength. Help me stay strong for my boy." Through the pantry door, she could hear the elevator chiming, announcing the arrival of the first dinner guests. Veronica's musical laugh floated through the apartment, perfectly pitched to impress. The burn of humiliation was still fresh, but Penelope straightened her shoulders. For Samuel, she would endure. For her precious son, she would keep her dignity, no matter what. Crystal glasses clinked and silverware sparkled under the elegant chandelier as New York's elite gathered around Richard Steele's massive dining table. Penelope moved efficiently between the kitchen and dining room, helping serve the elaborate 5-course meal. She tried to stay invisible, but Veronica's sharp eyes followed her every move. "Richard, darling," Veronica's voice cut through the dinner conversation, "didn't we discuss having more professional service staff for these occasions?" She gestured dismissively toward Penelope, who was quietly replacing an empty wine glass. Richard Steele sat at the head of the table, his face expressionless as he observed the interaction. His steel-gray eyes revealed nothing, but his fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around his wine glass. "The help seems to think she belongs here," Veronica continued, her perfect smile not masking the venom in her words. "Always hovering, lingering far too long. It's rather uncomfortable, don't you think?" The other guests shifted uneasily in their chairs, some casting sympathetic glances at Penelope, others pretending not to notice. The tension in the room grew thick as fog. Something snapped inside Penelope. Maybe it was the countless days of swallowing her pride, or the thought of Samuel waiting at home, or simply the last straw of Veronica's cruelty. Her heart pounded so hard she could barely hear her own words as they tumbled out. "Why not marry me instead?" The words hung in the air like suspended crystal. Forks clattered against plates. Someone gasped. Veronica's face turned white with shock. Penelope stood there, trembling but somehow still upright, her hands clasped tightly in front of her uniform. She couldn't believe what she'd just said, but she couldn't take it back now. Her eyes locked with Richard's, and for the first time, she saw something flicker in those cold gray depths: interest, perhaps even admiration. The silence stretched for what felt like hours. Then Richard Steele set down his wineglass with deliberate precision. His deep voice carried across the stunned room. "I accept." More gasps. Someone knocked over a water glass. Veronica's face contorted with rage and humiliation. "You cannot be serious." Veronica shrieked, her perfectly controlled facade crumbling. This Maid? Richard, have you lost your mind?" Richard's expression remained impassive. "I believe I was quite clear, Veronica." Veronica's chair scraped against the floor as she stood, shaking with fury. "This is absurd. I will not stand here and be humiliated by the help." She snatched up her designer purse and stormed toward the elevator, her heels stabbing the marble floor with each step. As the elevator doors closed behind Veronica, whispers erupted around the table. The other servants huddled in doorways, their eyes wide with disbelief. Penelope stood rooted to the spot, her mind spinning. What had she done? What had possessed her to challenge one of the most powerful men in New York? And why had he accepted? The weight of what had just happened settled over her like a heavy blanket. Her hands wouldn't stop shaking as she clutched the serving tray to her chest, wondering how a simple dinner service had turned her whole world upside down. Sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Richard Steele's penthouse, but the warmth couldn't reach Penelope as she stood outside his study the next morning. Her hands smoothed her simple dress. She hadn't worn her cleaning uniform today, but she felt just as out of place. "Come in." Richard's commanding voice responded to her soft knock. The study was impressive, with dark wood panels and walls of books reaching to the ceiling. Richard stood by the window, his tall frame silhouetted against the Manhattan skyline. He didn't turn around immediately. "Miss Johnson." His voice was cool and controlled. "Take a seat." Penelope perched on the edge of a leather chair, her back straight, hands folded in her lap. The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the silence. Finally, Richard turned to face her. His expression was unreadable. "I imagine you're wondering about me last night." "Mr. Steele, I should apologize," Penelope began, but he held up his hand. "No apologies necessary. In fact, you did something rather remarkable." He moved to sit behind his massive desk. "Do you know how many people dare to challenge me, Miss Johnson?" She shook her head. "None. They smile, they flatter, they scheme, but they never show real courage." His gray eyes studied her intently. "You did. That interests me." Penelope's heart quickened. "Sir, about what I said." "I meant what I said as well," he cut in. "I accept your proposal. I'm offering you a marriage of convenience. You'll have financial security, a proper home for your son, and I'll have a wife who isn't afraid to speak truth to power." His tone was businesslike, as if discussing a merger rather than marriage. "But," Penelope's voice trembled, "you don't even know me." "I know enough. You're hardworking, discreet, and clearly devoted to your child. Those qualities are more valuable than the social credentials Veronica brought to the table." He pulled out a folder. "My lawyers will draw up the arrangements." "Mr. Steele, please." Penelope tried again. "This is all happening so fast." "Time is valuable, Miss Johnson. I've made my decision." His tone left no room for argument. "The arrangements will be generous. Your son will want for nothing." Samuel's face flashed in Penelope's mind, his bright smile, his worn shoes, the way he tried to hide his disappointment when she couldn't afford the things other children had. She left the study in a daze, the elevator carrying her down to the busy street. The spring air felt different somehow, filled with possibility and terror all at once. Her heart thundered in her chest as she walked the 12 blocks to her tiny apartment. The babysitter, Mrs. Martinez from next door, was reading to Samuel when Penelope opened the door. Her son's face lit up at the sight of her, and he ran to wrap his arms around her waist. "Mommy, you're early today." Penelope hugged him tight, breathing in his familiar scent, feeling the flutter of hope and fear in her chest. Everything was about to change, and she wasn't sure if she was ready. Penelope stirred the pot of spaghetti on her small stove, the steam rising in their tiny kitchen. Samuel sat at their worn table, swinging his legs as he colored with his favorite crayons. "Mommy, how come we went to see the big man upstairs today?" Samuel looked up from his drawing, his brown eyes curious. The pasta nearly slipped from Penelope's spoon. "Mr. Steele? Well, he's going to be a special friend to us. Like Tommy's new daddy is to his mommy?" Samuel asked innocently. Penelope's cheeks flushed as she served their simple dinner. "Something like that, sweetheart. Would you like extra cheese?" "Yes, please." Samuel grinned, revealing the gap where he'd lost his front tooth. "The big man has a really big house. Did you see all those windows?" "I did." Penelope sat down across from him, her own plate untouched. "Samuel, honey, things might be changing for us soon. But I want you to know that no matter what happens, you're the most important person in my life." The next morning, Penelope found herself with no choice but to bring Samuel to the penthouse. Her regular babysitter was sick, and Mrs. Martinez had a doctor's appointment. Richard had requested her presence to discuss arrangements, and she couldn't refuse. The elevator ride up felt endless. Samuel pressed his nose against the glass, watching the city shrink below them. "Wow, Mommy, we're like birds up here." When they entered the penthouse, Richard was waiting in the dining room. His expression flickered with surprise at seeing Samuel, but he maintained his composure. "I apologize, Mr. Steele," Penelope said quickly. "I couldn't arrange care today." Richard waved off her concern. "It's fine. We should all get acquainted anyway." He gestured to the table where lunch was laid out. "Please, join me." Samuel's eyes widened at the spread of sandwiches and fruits. "Look, Mommy, they cut the crusts off." They settled into an awkward meal, with Samuel chattering about his kindergarten class while Richard watched him with an unreadable expression. Penelope barely touched her food, her stomach in knots. Then Samuel looked up at Richard with his innocent eyes and said the words that made time stop. "Mommy says you're my daddy." The sandwich in Richard's hand froze halfway to his mouth. His steel-gray eyes locked onto Penelope's face, which had gone pale. I never said that, Samuel," Penelope whispered. But Richard's jaw had set in a hard line. The warmth that had briefly appeared during lunch vanished, replaced by the cold, calculating look she remembered from their first meeting. "Miss Johnson," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "I believe we need to discuss something. Now." Penelope's hands trembled in her lap as she met his gaze. 5 years of carefully guarded secrets teetered on the edge of exposure. She'd known this moment might come, but she wasn't ready. She'd never be ready. The city had grown dark outside Richard's office windows, as Penelope sat rigidly in the leather chair across from his desk. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap, her knuckles white. The silence between them felt heavy, broken only by the soft ticking of an antique clock on the wall. "Tell me everything," Richard commanded, his voice controlled but threaded with anger. "And don't leave anything out." Penelope drew a shaky breath. "It was 5 years ago. I was working as a receptionist at the Lawrence Building downtown while taking night classes. You were there often, working on your first major development deal." Richard's jaw tightened as recognition flickered in his eyes. She continued, her voice soft but steady. "We talked in the lobby sometimes. You bought me coffee. One evening, you asked me to dinner." Penelope's eyes grew distant with the memory. "For 2 months, we saw each other. It wasn't just casual for me." "I remember," Richard said coldly. "But you disappeared. You were becoming successful. The papers started writing about you. Then that morning, I overheard you telling Mr. Lawrence that nothing would stand in the way of your empire. Not family, not relationships, nothing. Tears pricked at her eyes. A week later, I found out I was pregnant. Richard stood abruptly, pacing to the window. And you didn't think I had a right to know? I tried to call. Your secretary said you were too busy building your future to waste time on distractions. Penelope's voice cracked. I was scared and alone. I did what I had to do to survive. By becoming my maid? His laugh was harsh. Was that your plan all along? No. Penelope stood, finding strength in defending her integrity. I took whatever work I could find. When the agency sent me here, I thought maybe it was God's way of giving Samuel a chance to know his father. But I never planned to tell you. Richard turned, his face a storm of emotions. Yet here we are, with my son calling me daddy and you accepting my proposal. How convenient. It wasn't convenience, Penelope whispered. It was desperation. Veronica's cruelty, my fear for Samuel's future. I spoke without thinking. Well, now you'll have to think very carefully. Richard's voice grew dangerously quiet. If we marry, it will be on my terms. I'll acknowledge Samuel as my heir, but you'll sign whatever papers my lawyers draw up. You'll follow my rules. You'll be the perfect wife in public. Is that clear? Penelope sank back into her chair, feeling the weight of his words. Outside the vast windows, Manhattan's lights sparkled like distant, cold stars. She closed her eyes briefly, her lips moving in silent prayer. God, please soften his heart, she whispered, so quietly she thought he couldn't hear. But in the stillness of the office, even whispers carried. The city lights continued their cold glitter, indifferent to the lives being reshaped in the office, high above the streets. The morning sun cast long shadows across the steps of City Hall, as Penelope smoothed down the borrowed cream-colored dress. It was simple but elegant, loaned by one of the kinder maids who'd slipped it to her with a whispered, "Good luck." The fabric trembled slightly under her nervous fingers, as camera flashes exploded from the crowd of reporters gathered behind the barriers. Richard stood beside her, tall and imposing in his perfectly tailored charcoal suit. His face was a mask of professional calm, but his eyes remained distant, focused somewhere beyond the chaos around them. He placed his hand on the small of her back, guiding her up the steps, a gesture that looked intimate to the cameras but felt mechanical to Penelope. "Mrs. Steele, how does it feel to go from maid to millionaire?" a reporter shouted. "Mr. Steele, what made you choose your housekeeper as your bride?" The questions pelted them like rain, but Richard's stern glare kept the press at bay as they entered the building. The ceremony itself was brief and businesslike, with only Samuel present as a witness, fidgeting in his little suit. When the judge pronounced them husband and wife, Richard's kiss was quick and cold, perfectly calculated for the photographs that would soon flood every newspaper in New York. By afternoon, the headlines were everywhere. Billionaire weds maid in shock ceremony, and Cinderella story or calculated move. Penelope's phone buzzed constantly with messages from old friends and curious strangers alike. She turned it off, unable to bear the attention. At an exclusive Upper East Side restaurant, Veronica held court among her social circle, her voice dripping with venom. "Of course she planned it all," she announced to her rapt audience. "She's been manipulating him from the start. I caught her going through his private papers months ago." The lie spread quickly through Manhattan's elite circles, each retelling growing more elaborate. Richard, true to his word, defended Penelope publicly. At a hastily arranged press conference, he stood at her side, his arm around her waist. "My wife deserves respect," he declared firmly, his voice carrying authority that brooked no argument. "Our private life is our own, but in private, within the gleaming walls of the penthouse, that same authority created a chasm between them." Richard retreated to his home office immediately after dinner, leaving Penelope to put Samuel to bed alone. The little boy was excited about his new room, but confused by the tension he could sense. "Daddy's still working?" he asked sleepily, as Penelope tucked him in. "Yes, sweetheart, he's very busy." She kissed his forehead, her heart aching at the innocence in his question. Later that night, Penelope knelt beside her bed, their bed, though Richard had yet to sleep in it. Samuel lay in the middle, having crawled in after a nightmare. His peaceful breathing was the only sound in the vast room as she clasped her hands in prayer. "Dear Lord," she whispered, "give me strength." Help me show him that love isn't a weakness. Help him see that family isn't a distraction from success, but the greatest success of all. From the study down the hall came the faint sound of Richard's voice on a business call, as distant as the stars outside the window. Samuel stirred slightly, unknowingly creating a physical barrier between his parents' sides of the bed, a small but powerful symbol of the invisible wall between them. The crystal room at the Plaza Hotel sparkled with wealth and privilege. Penelope smoothed her navy silk dress, the first expensive thing she'd ever owned, and took a deep breath before entering. The annual Children's Hospital Foundation luncheon was her debut as Mrs. Richard Steele, and the room was filled with New York's most influential women. Conversations died as she walked in, replaced by poorly concealed whispers behind manicured hands. "Can you believe she's actually here? I heard she trapped him by claiming the child was his. Just look at how she holds that fork, pure servant class." Penelope kept her head high, though her cheeks burned. She focused on arranging her napkin just so, remembering her mother's words. "True dignity comes from how you treat others, not from what others think of you." A young waitress approached, her hands trembling as she served the first course. The girl stumbled slightly, nearly spilling soup on Penelope's new dress. Several women at nearby tables smirked, clearly expecting, perhaps hoping, for a scene. "Are you all right?" Penelope asked softly, steadying the girl's hand. "These floors can be tricky in heels. I remember my first serving job. I spilled an entire tray of champagne my first day." The waitress's eyes widened with gratitude. "Thank you, Mrs. Steele. I'm so sorry. Nothing to be sorry for." Penelope smiled warmly. "And please, call me Penelope." A photographer from the society pages caught the moment. Penelope's gentle smile, her hand steadying the waitress's arm, while in the background, several society women wore expressions of obvious disdain. Throughout the luncheon, Penelope maintained her composure. When Mrs. Ashworth loudly commented that some people didn't know their proper place, Penelope simply turned and complimented her lovely brooch. When another woman, accidentally, knocked Penelope's purse off the table, she picked it up herself with a gracious smile. That evening, Richard sat in his study, scrolling through the day's media coverage on his tablet. His eyes lingered on the photograph from the luncheon. The caption read, "New Mrs. Steele shows true class." The article praised her grace under pressure and highlighted how she'd treated everyone, from fellow guests to serving staff, with equal kindness. Richard zoomed in on Penelope's face in the picture. There was something there he hadn't noticed before, a quiet strength that had nothing to do with money or social position. Despite everything those women had thrown at her, she'd maintained not just dignity, but genuine kindness. He set down the tablet, lost in thought. The woman he'd married for convenience was proving to be far more intriguing than he'd expected. Her response to humiliation wasn't anger or revenge, but grace, and somehow, that seemed to give her more power than all the social maneuvering of New York's elite. The evening sun painted golden streaks across the penthouse's marble floors as tiny feet pattered down the hallway. Samuel, clutching a piece of paper to his chest, raced toward Richard's study with the boundless energy only a child could possess. "Mr. Richard, Mr. Richard," Samuel called out, pushing the heavy door open with both hands. "Look what I made." Richard glanced up from his laptop, his usual stern expression fixed in place. "Samuel, I'm quite busy with." But Samuel was already beside him, holding up a crayon drawing with pride shining in his eyes. "It's our family. See? That's you, and Mommy, and me." Richard's words caught in his throat as he studied the childish scribbles. 3 figures stood hand in hand. A tall one in a black suit, a medium one with long brown hair, and a small one with a big smile. Above them, Samuel had drawn a bright yellow sun and fluffy clouds. The words "Our Family" were written in wobbly letters across the top. Something shifted in Richard's chest as he looked at the pure hope in Samuel's eyes. Without thinking, his hand reached out to touch the paper gently. "This is very good, Samuel," he said, his voice softer than usual. Meanwhile, Penelope was making her own quiet changes in the household. She gathered the staff in the kitchen, speaking to them not as servants but as valued team members. "I know what it's like to work here," she said warmly. "I want to hear your ideas about how we can make things better for everyone." The staff, initially wary, began to open up. Maria, the cook, suggested better scheduling for the kitchen staff. James, the doorman, mentioned needed repairs to the service entrance. Penelope listened carefully, taking notes and implementing changes that made their work lives easier. One evening, as Richard returned from work, he overheard laughter from the kitchen, a sound that had never before echoed through the penthouse's pristine halls. He paused, watching as Penelope helped the housekeepers organize supplies while they chatted companionably. Later that night, during dinner, Penelope cleared her throat nervously. "I had an idea I wanted to discuss with you." Richard raised an eyebrow but nodded for her to continue. "The penthouse would be perfect for hosting a charity fundraiser," she said. "For children in foster care and group homes. I've been thinking about how blessed Samuel is, and how many children don't have." "You want to open our home to strangers?" Richard interrupted, but his tone lacked its usual sharp edge. "These children need advocates," Penelope said softly but firmly. "Someone to show them they matter." Richard studied her face, seeing the same compassion that had won over his staff. To his own surprise, he found himself considering it. Later that night, Richard walked past Samuel's room and stopped. The door was cracked open, and inside, Penelope knelt beside Samuel's bed. Their voices carried softly as they said their nightly prayers. "Dear God," Samuel's small voice piped up, "thank you for Mommy and Mr. Richard and our home." Richard leaned against the doorframe, watching as Penelope smoothed Samuel's hair back tenderly. A smile tugged at his lips before he even realized it was there. The scene before him stirred something long dormant in his heart, a yearning for the family warmth he'd always dismissed as unnecessary. The penthouse ballroom sparkled with elegant decorations as children from local group homes filled the space with joyful laughter. Penelope had transformed, in the usually austere room, into a welcoming haven. With colorful balloons and hand-painted welcome signs made by Samuel, Richard stood at the edge of the crowd, watching as Penelope knelt down to speak with a small girl in a well-worn dress. The child's eyes lit up as Penelope listened intently to her story, treating her with the same respect she would show any guest. "Thank you for making us feel special," the little girl said, throwing her arms around Penelope's neck. "Nobody ever does that." More children gathered around Penelope, each wanting to share their stories. One boy proudly showed her his report card, while another explained her dream of becoming a doctor. Penelope gave each child her full attention, offering encouragement and genuine interest. From his corner, Richard noticed how naturally Penelope connected with everyone, from the corporate donors to the social workers to the children themselves. She moved between groups with grace, making sure everyone felt valued. It was so different from the cold efficiency of his usual business events. As the evening wound down, one of the older boys approached Penelope with tears in his eyes. "Mrs. Steele, I never thought I'd be in a place like this. You made us feel like we belong." Richard felt an unfamiliar tightness in his chest, watching the scene unfold. The genuine gratitude in the children's faces stirred something in him he thought he'd buried long ago. Later that night, after the last guest had left and Samuel was asleep, Richard found Penelope in the living room. She was sitting quietly, still wearing her simple but elegant blue dress from the event. "You did well tonight," he said softly, surprising himself with the warmth in his voice. Penelope looked up, her eyes tired but happy. The children deserved it. Everyone deserves to feel worthy of kindness. Richard moved closer, studying her face. "You're not just a maid who married me for convenience, are you? He paused, choosing his words carefully. "You're bringing life back to this place. To me." Their eyes met, and for the first time, Richard let his guard down completely. He reached out, gently touching her cheek. Penelope's breath caught as he leaned in, pressing his lips to hers in a tender kiss. It wasn't passionate or demanding, but filled with something deeper: recognition, gratitude, and the first stirrings of real love. When they parted, Penelope's eyes shimmered with tears. She excused herself quietly, retreating to her room where she knelt beside her bed. "Thank you, Lord," she whispered. her heart full of gratitude for this glimpse of the man beneath Richard's stern exterior. In his own room, Richard lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The feeling of Penelope's lips on his, the warmth in his chest when she smiled, these sensations both thrilled and terrified him. He hadn't allowed himself to feel this vulnerable since his youth, and the intensity of these emotions left him unsettled in the darkness. The morning headlines hit like a thunderbolt. Maid manipulates billionaire. Claims child is his screamed across every major newspaper and website. Richard's business rival, James Montgomery, had released a devastating exposé, complete with old photos of Penelope in her maid's uniform and speculation about her motives. Penelope's hands trembled as she read the article over breakfast. The words burned into her mind. Sources claim the former cleaning lady orchestrated an elaborate scheme to trap one of New York's wealthiest men. Samuel sat nearby, innocently munching his cereal, unaware of how their world was crumbling. The penthouse phone rang constantly. Richard's assistant reported that investors were pulling out of deals, and the company's stock was plummeting. Social media exploded with cruel memes and jokes about the maid who cleaned up. Even former friends who had attended their charity event now publicly questioned Penelope's character. Richard stormed into the penthouse. That afternoon, his face twisted with rage. He threw a newspaper onto the kitchen counter where Penelope stood. "Is this what you wanted all along?" he demanded, his voice sharp as ice. "To trap me? To force your way into my world?" "Richard, please," Penelope whispered, reaching for his hand. "You know that's not true." He jerked away from her touch. "Do I? Maybe they're right. Maybe this was all an elaborate con. The perfect setup, the humble maid, the innocent child, the touching story of struggling alone." His words dripped with sarcasm. "How can you say that?" Tears spilled down Penelope's cheeks. "After everything we've shared?" "Shared?" Richard laughed bitterly. "What have we shared except a marriage of convenience that's now destroying everything I've built? My reputation, my business, it's all falling apart because I was fool enough to trust you." Samuel appeared in the doorway, clutching his teddy bear. "Daddy, why are you yelling at Mommy?" Richard's face hardened. "I'm not your daddy. I'm just another victim of your mother's schemes." Penelope gathered Samuel in her arms, her heart shattering at Richard's cruel words. "We'll go," she said quietly. "You've made your feelings clear." Moving quickly, she packed 2 small suitcases with essential items. Her hands shook as she folded Samuel's favorite pajamas and tucked away the family drawing he'd made. Richard watched from his study, refusing to meet her eyes. "I never schemed or lied," Penelope said as she headed for the elevator. "I just loved you, both then and now. I pray someday you'll understand that." The rain poured outside as they exited the luxury building for the last time. Samuel pressed his face against the taxi window, watching his toys and books disappear into the distance. Penelope held him close as they drove through Manhattan's gleaming streets toward their old neighborhood. The taxi's windshield wipers beat a steady rhythm, mixing with Samuel's quiet sniffles and Penelope's silent prayers. The bright lights of Richard's world faded behind them, replaced by the familiar worn buildings of their former life. Richard Steele stood in the elevator, watching the numbers climb to the penthouse floor. His footsteps echoed through the empty hallway as he entered his home, if he could still call it that. The silence hit him first. No cheerful cartoons playing on the television. No patter of small feet running to greet him. No soft humming from the kitchen where Penelope would usually be preparing dinner. He loosened his tie and walked through the vast living room, now feeling more like a museum than a home. Samuel's toy cars still lay scattered near the coffee table where they'd played just yesterday morning. A half-finished puzzle remained on the side table, the pieces frozen in time where Penelope had left them. In the kitchen, he found Samuel's favorite cereal bowl in the dish rack, decorated with superhero characters. The sight of it made his throat tighten. The boy had brought so much life into these sterile rooms, his innocent laughter bouncing off the marble countertops and high ceilings. Richard poured himself a drink and walked to his study. The evening light cast long shadows across his empire of emptiness. All the awards, the certificates of achievement, the magazine covers featuring his success, they seemed to mock him now. What good was being worth $10 billion when he felt so utterly bankrupt inside? He sank into his leather chair, remembering how he'd found Penelope praying in this very room late one night. She hadn't known he was watching as she whispered, "Lord, help him find peace. Help him open his heart." At the time, he'd dismissed it as simplistic sentiment. Now her words haunted him. Samuel's voice echoed in his memory. "Daddy, look what I made." The pure joy in those words, the unconditional love in those little arms that would wrap around his legs each evening. How had he thrown that away so easily? His eyes fell on his desk, where Samuel's drawing still lay. 3 stick figures holding hands, a tall one in a suit, a smaller one with long hair, and the tiniest between them. "Our family," written in wobbly letters across the top, decorated with hearts and stars. Richard picked it up with trembling hands, studying the simple artwork that contained everything he'd foolishly discarded. A drop fell on the paper, smudging the crayon slightly. Richard touched his cheek, surprised to find it wet. When was the last time he had cried? He couldn't remember. But now, alone in his vast penthouse with nothing but his pride and his possessions, the tears wouldn't stop. The drawing blurred before his eyes as he remembered Penelope's last words. "I just loved you, both then and now." The truth of those words pierced the armor he'd built around his heart. What had he done? How had he let his fear and pride destroy the most precious gift he'd ever received? Richard's polished shoes clicked against the marble floor of the Steel Enterprises boardroom. Around the long mahogany table, 12 board members droned on about quarterly reports and market projections. Usually, these meetings commanded his full attention. They were the heartbeat of his empire. But today, his mind kept drifting to a small apartment across town. "Mr. Steele?" The CFO's voice cut through his thoughts. "Your thoughts on the merger proposal?" Richard blinked, straightening in his chair. "Continue with the presentation," he said, his voice carrying its usual authority even as his thoughts scattered like leaves in the wind. Numbers and charts flashed across the screen, but instead of seeing profit margins, he saw Samuel's drawing. Instead of hearing market analyses, he heard Penelope's gentle voice reading bedtime stories. The meeting dragged on for 2 more hours, feeling like an eternity. As soon as it ended, Richard slipped out of the building, dismissing his driver. He took a taxi instead, directing it to a modest neighborhood he'd never visited before today. The church stood on a corner, its white steeple reaching toward the cloudy sky. Richard watched from across the street, partially hidden behind a newspaper stand. Penelope moved efficiently between tables laden with canned goods and fresh produce, organizing volunteers with quiet confidence. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, her clothes practical rather than designer labels. Yet she carried herself with a dignity that outshone any society woman he'd known. He watched as she knelt to help a little girl pick up spilled apples, her smile genuine and warm. The child's mother looked exhausted, probably working multiple jobs like Penelope once had. Instead of rushing them along, Penelope took time to chat, squeezing the woman's shoulder in encouragement. A line of people stretched around the block, families struggling to make ends meet. Penelope treated each one with respect, looking them in the eye, learning their names. She wasn't just handing out food, she was giving them hope and dignity. Richard's chest tightened as he remembered how he'd accused her of being a schemer. The truth was right here before his eyes. She had always been genuine, always thinking of others before herself. Her faith wasn't just words, it was action, lived out in simple acts of kindness. He watched her pray with an elderly man who looked close to tears, her hand holding his weathered one. The man left with more than just a bag of groceries. He left standing taller, touched by her compassion. In that moment, Richard felt smaller than he had in years. His billions couldn't buy the kind of wealth Penelope possessed, a wealth of spirit, of genuine love for others. His pride had blinded him, but now he saw clearly. He had to make things right, no matter the cost to his ego or his carefully constructed image. The small church buzzed with Sunday morning activity. Sunlight streamed through stained glass windows as the congregation settled into worn wooden pews. Penelope sat near the front, Samuel fidgeting beside her as the organist played the opening hymn. The heavy doors creaked open. A collective gasp rippled through the church as Richard Steele's imposing figure appeared in the doorway. His usual tailored suit was gone, replaced by a simple dark jacket. His face, normally masked with stern authority, showed raw vulnerability. Every head turned as his footsteps echoed down the center aisle. Some people whispered, others stared open-mouthed. Samuel spotted him first, tugging at his mother's sleeve. "Mommy, look!" Penelope froze as Richard approached their pew. Without hesitation, he dropped to his knees before them, his voice thick with emotion. "Penelope, Samuel, I've been so wrong. My pride blinded me to what truly matters." Tears rolled down his cheeks as he continued. "I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I love you both. I want to be the husband and father you deserve. Not just someone who provides money, but someone who provides love, support, and partnership." The church fell silent, every person holding their breath. Samuel reached out and touched Richard's wet cheek, his small gesture of acceptance making several people sniffle. Penelope's hands trembled as she looked at the man kneeling before her, not the fearsome billionaire, but a humbled soul seeking redemption. Slowly, she extended her hand toward his. As their fingers intertwined, an elderly woman in the back called out, "Amen." The word spread like a wave, and suddenly the whole church erupted in applause and joyful exclamations. Through tears, Penelope smiled, her simple faith rewarded at last. The elevator doors opened to the penthouse, but this time it felt different. Penelope held Samuel's hand while Richard carried their bags, his demeanor softer than ever before. The once cold space now felt warm with possibility. "Welcome home," Richard said softly, setting down the luggage. Samuel ran excitedly to his new room, which Richard had personally helped decorate with dinosaur stickers and a rocket-shaped nightlight. In the following weeks, Richard's transformation became evident in his business dealings. During a crucial board meeting, he firmly rejected a profitable but questionable merger. "We'll build this company on integrity," he declared, surprising his executives. Penelope flourished in her new role, organizing children's charity events with the same care she once showed as a maid. The staff who had once whispered about her now sought her guidance, drawn to her genuine warmth and wisdom. Samuel's laughter echoed through the halls as he played catch with his father in the evening, their shadows dancing on the walls. Richard learned to leave work earlier, discovering joy in these simple moments he'd once dismissed. That evening, they gathered around the kitchen table, not the formal dining room. The aroma of Penelope's home-cooked lasagna filled the air. Richard loosened his tie, helping Samuel cut his food while sharing stories about their day. Their genuine laughter bounced off the walls that had once known only silence, transforming the penthouse into a true home at last. The autumn breeze carried the sound of excited chatter as crowds gathered outside the newly constructed Hope Children's Center. Richard and Penelope walked hand in hand, their fingers intertwined, approaching the bright red ribbon that stretched across the entrance. Samuel, wearing a small suit that matched his father's, bounced on his toes as he held the oversized scissors. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard addressed the crowd, his voice warm where it had once been cold. "This center represents more than just a building. It represents second chances." His eyes met Penelope's, filled with tender meaning. Cameras flashed as Samuel, with help from both his parents, cut the ribbon. The crowd erupted in applause. Even those who had once sneered at Penelope now watched with grudging respect. The society columnists who had mocked the maid-turned-wife now wrote glowing pieces about her influence on Richard Steele, the billionaire whose heart had thawed. Inside, children played on new equipment, while parents toured the facility. The staff, many hired from underprivileged backgrounds, beamed with pride. This was Penelope's vision brought to life, a place of hope and new beginnings. As the sun painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, Richard pulled Penelope close on the center's rooftop garden. "You saved me," he whispered against her hair, his voice thick with emotion. Penelope turned in his embrace, her eyes shining. "God saved us both," she replied softly. Below them, Samuel's delighted laughter rang out as he played with new friends, the sound carrying up to them like a blessing on the evening air. They held each other close, their shared warmth a testimony to love's transforming power. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.